As the author of the Big Data Framework, today's guest, Jan Willem Middelburg, is making great strides in building a global big data community. He explains that any big data initiative must link with a corporate strategy and shares how a telecom company was able to start predicting customer retention using the approach. In any transformation, he says, the technology is the easy part. As well as discussing the impact of regulation regarding data sharing between countries, he shares with us his 15-second acid test to prove the benefits of data analytics. Namely, do you think you know you have a good idea or know you have a good idea? Data-driven decisions transform an idea from a hunch or intuition into a quantifiable opportunity. Welcome, Jan Willem.
Thanks, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be on your show today. I really look forward to talking to you.
People who have worked with you sort of describe you as someone who knows what you want and knows how to make it happen. So I'm fascinated to know why you set up the Enterprise Big Data Framework about 5 years ago. What inspired you to do that?
Well, that's a very honorable description, and I'm quite pleased to be described that way. The background of Big Data Framework is actually quite fascinating because it was kind of born because we experienced a lag. I was involved with doing large big data implementations at a couple of large-scale enterprise organizations. And what we found while we were doing that there was no uniform structure on how to apply that. So a lot of big data implementations always talk around technology, data, tools, but they don't talk about capability. They don't talk about the fact that you would need to set up processes in a large organization. They don't talk about the fact that you need to structure your organization in a certain way to make that happen. So kind of that was the inspiration for the Big Data Framework. And as you know, I'm very well versed in best practices across the board. Started with best practices in project management, service management, and a variety of different ways. One of the common denominators there is that it's very well organized. There's a very clear structure. It showcases companies what they would need to do and when they would need to do it. And that was lacking for the whole domain of big data. That kind of provided the inspiration to create that and to look at what are critical capabilities that enterprises need to move forward.
So, are you saying then that there isn't an industry standard definition of big data? There's no recommended way an organization should transform, or at least there wasn't, 5 years ago when you started on this quest to help organizations understand big data. I mean, really, was it really a wild west out there with no real guidance?
Well, I think you could say that to a certain extent. Not that there was no complete guidance, but what you really saw is that the whole conversation was driven by the technology vendors. So all of the big tech companies that have a very specific interest in the fact that you're using their processors and their databases, etc. So what I found, and that was really, really lacking at the time, is that there was no guidance from a vendor-independent approach, not one that is focused around how do you build up a big data enterprise, regardless of the technology that you're using. I kind of think that's the unique part of what we were able to accomplish with the Enterprise Big Data Framework, is that it's completely vendor-based model or vendor-neutral model, and it's based completely upon capabilities and best practices. So it doesn't really matter what your underlying technology stack is or what kind of industry you're in. It showcases a roadmap on how do you build those capabilities over a longer period of time. And I think that was the gap. If I would call it a Wild West, I don't know. But that was a significant gap that we saw. And I think because it was a large gap, that was also the reason that so many people jumped on it as a framework that they could use and embrace, because it was a uniform approach.
I mean, this is fascinating. This conversation around the technology. I've seen some very impressive visualizations of large data sets in various hackathons. And it all looks fairly easy to the people that are creating these things. But what is the really tough part about understanding big data? Is it the technology stack, or is it the business insight into what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of the matter, and that's a very good question to ask, because it's not about the technology. Because yes, you're correct. Some data scientists, they're fully much able to create the most beautiful visualizations, which all kinds of cool graphs that are very inspiring. However, where it lacks is that you also need, especially in a larger enterprise, you need to make sure that big data is embedded in a sustainable way, and that there's a business case for it. So ultimately, it's a business decision. So you need to make more money than you spend. So it's very easy to kind of send a couple of data scientists into the wild and say, come up with some beautiful visualizations. But in the end, it's around where does that make value for a big company. And that's also why in a lot of larger enterprises, what I've experienced close by is that they either scale down or they don't consider it a success, because they were not able to actually showcase that this is a sustainable model, and that people who actually do all this kind of analysis bring that amount of value. So that's the line I think you need to balance. And what I always start explaining when I start with the quick introduction of what the framework is trying to accomplish is that you will always need to start from a strategy part. So what is it what you're trying to accomplish? As you probably know, with big data, there are so many data sets out there. You can potentially spend the rest of your life analyzing all kind of cool and nice things. And that's also what you see happening every now and then on the internet. There's a cool visualization. But the question is, does that visualization make any money? Does that bring any kind of business value towards a large company? And that's where the difficulty is.
So yeah, well, working with clients and sort of trying to get them to adopt the big data framework and to move down this transformation. Do you have a favorite story? Do you have a favorite example of something that was uncovered by an organization that added real value that wasn't really considered in the past?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of use cases that you now start to see to become a little bit more industry standard, but they were not so common a couple of years ago. One of the my favorite case studies is a company who embraced this and did a project in Taiwan. It's a big telco company. And what they did is that they started to look at all of their customer data. And what we looked at is, can we build a predictive model that, based on the behavior of that customer on their website and on the amount of usage of their phone bills, etc., can we predict whether that person at the end of their contract is going to switch a provider, which is a concept known as churn, or not? And that model proved to be tremendously accurate. So if there is no engagement, if people don't visit the website, it's a very strong telling tale that people are not interested in renewing their contract. And by separating that and by specifically targeting that group, they were able to reduce that churn with around 15%, which is, in terms of business value, now that we talk about that, it's tremendous.
That sounds pretty intuitive to me. So is big data really about providing the evidence to support or not to support a hunch or an intuition? So you're driven by the data rather than by what you think might be the case.
I absolutely believe that. A lot of organizations still make decisions because they think that's the best way forward. What I always try to do when somebody comes up in our company with an idea or something is I always ask the question, do you think that's a good idea, or do you know that that's a good idea? And the difference in that question is quite exemplary on, have you done your research? Do you have the data to back up those facts? And I think if every manager were to ask that question, a little bit more often, then you get more towards a data-driven enterprise. And all of the facts show that in the end, if you take data-driven decisions consistently, whether it's in marketing or finance or any kind of product development decision, ultimately those decisions are better than just people who make decisions based upon what they think is a good idea. and that's a numbers game. And I'm not going to say that, obviously there are some brilliant inventors who come up with an idea that they completely invented by themselves. But generally speaking, across the whole board, if you, in a larger company, if you take more data driven decisions, then you will outperform competitors.
I think that's very true. I can understand that. But with big data, won't data privacy laws restrict this? As we move towards, well, I think the world is moving down two different paths. There's this view that, can I get the data out of my organization to enable me to make data-driven decisions? And there's another part that says, any of my personal information I want to protect and you can't use it. So what's the impact of the data privacy laws on organizations' ability to mine and use data to enable them to make those data-driven decisions?
Well, I think you're touching upon what is going to be one of the biggest questions of the 21st century, because what you're going to, or at least what I'm seeing, is that the world is moving two different ways. So I'm based in Asia Pacific, where there's a lot more freedom when it comes to data privacy. In Europe, they're being way and way more strict. So it's going in two different directions, very, very clearly. And it's a very difficult question to answer, because it all depends a little bit on what is your belief system, and what is the value that you or an organization places on data privacy. So let me express it a little bit in terms of the scandals that we've seen across the world. I think one of the most famous cases is obviously Cambridge Analytica, that used publicly available data to manipulate how people can vote, and are able, or at least claim, that they had an influence on the outcome of elections. Obviously, that is one of the dangers of big data, because the whole world, whether it's the stock market or the way that people vote, or the things that people do on a general basis, is moving in similar patterns. And the big paradox of our time is that everyone thinks they're unique, but if you put it on a larger scale, then we're all behaving very similarly. And the way I always like to explain this is think about your neighborhood. You are living in a particular neighborhood because you fall within a particular income class. You like to have a particular family situation. You like to go to particular grocery stores, which might be nearby. You live and work in a building close by. So if you take that on a more macro scale, you're going to see that all the people that live in your street have similar properties. You'll still, on a micro level, find that you're very individual and very unique. But in a bigger picture, that is a completely different dynamic than another town or in another country. So it all depends on what kind of scale you look at things. And the big paradox of our time is that even though we all think we're more individualistic, we're moving more in similar patterns, because the data-driven decisions that companies make are based upon those target groups. A lot of discussion is currently going on to the extent of what is personal or private information. But the fact that you live in a particular street, which is probably public information, will already tell me something, or will tell me quite a lot about what kind of things you probably like. And that's the difficult part. There's no real clear answer, I would say, at this moment on how do regulations should or could even cover that towards the future.
It's a real problem, isn't it? Because the internet, says basically there's one world. We're all part of that world. Information crosses borders. Nobody knows a physical boundary. Yet you now see governments starting to revert back to their national territory, and you can't, if you use my data in my country, you can't take it out of my country because I don't want it to go somewhere else. So, as you say, it's going to be a huge challenge on how organizations can grow and use the information they have against the nationalistic view about we want to keep it within our boundaries. So do you think we're going to see the growth of things like data trusts, where people sign up to sharing some data under some form of legal or quasi-legal agreement, to deal with this issue, or do you think there's another route out of the problem?
No, well, if I would have a clear route out of the problem, I would have probably published something on that, or to have a recommendation in that area. Every government in the world is struggling with this question to a certain extent, because some of the elements are easy. Where do we store data? We can kind of still make that within boundaries of a data center somewhere on Earth. But it already gets way more complex when we're talking about features of behavior, or the fact on how we're thinking or what we're looking at online, because that is almost untrackable. Where in which particular country that is happening. Every different, well, most of the websites you visit will be hosted in different servers in different locations. So this morning I was on the APMG website, which I think will be hosted in the UK. Our website is obviously hosted here in Malaysia. So only that issue alone is an unsolvable kind of problem that we're going to get into. So the data trust that you're mentioning, I think, is a very interesting development. And I support the idea behind it, in the sense that you are going to give active consent in order to use something. But whether it's going to be practical and workable, that's a whole different thing. And that also brings me towards kind of a separate discussion. I don't know if we have time for that, but it's the extent to which people are willing to pay for these kinds of services. One of the very famous phrases that you hear a lot in the domain of big data is, if the service is free, you are the product. And whereas there's a lot of people who want to be participants in these trusts, or that would like to have control, at the same time sign up for a free Gmail account, and they have a Facebook profile, and they do expect a lot of services to be free. So that's also a very big equilibrium that is not an easy.
Yeah, and I suppose it's because we've been brought up on the internet is free. I mean, if you think about it, imagine we had to pay for emails, so that whenever an email was delivered,
that would be a fascinating concept.
And it may
right?
not be a bad way, of course, of actually dealing with the huge energy costs associated with running server farms and that. If you had to register and it cost you a cent or 0.1 of a cent every time you received an email, or every time you sent an email, then what would happen? People's behavior would change.
Absolutely. But I think from a competitive perspective, there will always be companies, whether that is within regulated markets or not, that if, let's say that the biggest companies in the world are going to charge for paid services like email, then even at that moment in time, there will be other companies who are going to start offering it for free, and people will en masse switch towards the free service. So this personal inclination that we have in order to use free services comes at a cost, and that cost is obviously the whole issues around that data privacy that we just mentioned. I wouldn't know if there is a straightforward way out of this. I actually believe there isn't. But it's up to corporates and larger companies to find the most, I would say, respectful way and the most fair way in order to deal with it.
Yeah, Willem, sort of one final question for you. You said you started life in the world of best practice and in the world of programs and project management. There's a growing group of professionals who now believe that data analytics will transform the success of projects, predominantly through better forecasting, by actually getting the facts about what actually happened on the project, rather than those very rosy memories of what people thought happened on the project. Do you see the use of data analytics and big data in the area of project management something that's going to accelerate, maybe grow rapidly over the next few years? Or is it just in the mix of the world of data analytics?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm probably going to say something that doesn't make me very popular, but you could say that the project managers have come awake a little bit, in the sense that, hey, through data, we can actually see what is happening in the project. Yeah, I think that will be a massive trend. The difficult part, however, is that I know quite a number of project managers in my career. Very few know how to write any kind of line of code or read any kind of computer program. that's going to be the big challenge, because saying we would like to have those insights in the project does mean that you need to get some skills and some knowledge to dive into that. And that's where the major not problem, but a challenge is going to be, is acquiring some more technical skills to actually look into that. Because this
But you
doesn't
could
happen overnight.
see the growth of the data analyst or the savvy project program support office person actually majoring on the ability to draw data out of databases of an organization's projects, put them up in an easily understood way for the project managers, the project boards to consider. So you could see that working quite well,
Absolutely.
because you are working in an area where there should be lots of data and there should be lots of historic data.
Absolutely.
But you're right.
No, and that's 100% correct. And I think we're going to see that more and more. And it kind of brings me back to one of the previous points, because through this data analysis and the analytics, you actually know what is happening in the project instead of what you think is happening in the project. And I think that's the major mind shift change that I'd like to people to see and to consider, is that this is an opportunity to kind of make more fact-driven decisions. And whether that's in project management or even IT services, or even in the way that we design systems or architectures, those kind of fact-based, data-driven decisions ultimately will be in the benefit of a company if you compare it to competitors.
Fascinating conversation, Jan Willem. I'm sure we could go on and on and on. So many thanks. Many
For
thanks
sure.
for finding the time to talk to me today. And good luck in your crusade to get more and more people to take to a data-driven decision-making approach to make the world a better place. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Richard, for hosting me. As always, it's a big pleasure to
Thank
talk to
you.
you.